Welcome to another episode of the Space Salvi Institute podcast. Today is a special treat. We're with D.C. Schindler, an old teacher of mine and somebody whose writings I go back to constantly. I'm constantly looking on YouTube to see if there's a new podcast with D.C. Schindler or a new lecture. And a couple of months ago, there was a podcast with the New Polity crowd where D.C. Schindler was talking about authority. So I guess before jumping into things, I just want to say, DC Schindler, thanks for coming on. It's good to see you. We had you on like two times before.
Yeah, yeah, no, always a pleasure. It's always great to see you and catch up again.
Yeah.
So,
So let's dive into things. I first learned about, your kind of that you've been writing on authority because of the podcast episode through New Polity, which is great with Andrew Willard Jones. And so I reached out to you and said, okay, I heard you're working on this book, which I believe is going to be coming out as it's called Authority and Its Counterfeits.
that's correct. Yeah,
Okay.
right. And then the subtitle, working subtitle. I'm still, it's still trying to find its publisher. I'm waiting to hear from one.
Okay.
So I
I'm
I,
sure.
I can't predict when it's going to come out, but it's been a while. Still waiting to hear. The working subtitle is the so a authority and its counterfeits, a political, poetical, philosophical, and theological theory. And that's a mouthful. I'm sure the editor is going to throw it out, but I wanted to try to indicate we tend to pigeonhole the theme of authority in a way that makes it not very interesting. And as I delved into the topic and thought about it, I started to realize that all of these dimensions are essential to be able to give a proper interpretation of it. And one of the reasons why I think it has been disappearing is that we've had such an impoverished view. And the impoverishment is in part because we've restricted the scope
Yeah.
of it so much. So
Let's
anyway,
get
I'm
into
kind of
that. I
anticipating a lot of things, but that's
well,
that.
this is
Yeah, that's
something
an
that's been on my mind now that I've been teaching history for the past 3 years, and I have to go over like the full sweep of history, from like all the way back to, the Sumerians to like the current, I mean, at least 1989.
mhm.
And it's actually for me, once reading this essay, it's like almost everything, the authority is like the main theme.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
today I had to go over the 30 Years' War and some other English Civil War with another class, and just, the 1600s. And it's very, very brief overview. But I asked the students because, we covered the Reformation a couple weeks
mhm,
ago, and,
mhm.
we were talking about it in terms of authority.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
the class I asked them today, so what is authority
yeah.
really? And this girl raised her hand and she says, well, it's power. And I
Hmm.
said, come on, it's not just any power. So another kid raised his hand and he said, well, it's like legitimate power.
Yeah,
Okay, I'm like, and then I asked him, so well then how do we figure out like about how does it get any legitimacy?
right,
Um, and
right.
they were thinking a little bit here, and they gave this almost, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. They said it was like, well, in some sense, people, we consent to it.
Yeah,
And that's what
yeah,
makes it legitimate.
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
like, I couldn't believe it. And so I'm like, okay, let's explore that. Is that truly the case?
Yeah,
Is that truly
yeah,
the case?
yeah,
And if so,
yeah,
why?
yeah,
So I was thinking about your piece, and I just thought, in the first part of your article or your chapter of your essay is on authority and power. And you talk
yeah.
about this restriction of authority in the modern era. So why is authority and power, how are they different?
Yeah. I mean, that's a huge question. And it's been a little while since I've read the essay. So the essay you're talking about is one that's going to appear in Communio. And I wrote that in light of having written this book manuscript. So it's a way of in a much sort of briefer scope, tying together a bunch of ideas. And so many of them are gestured at. I mean, these are such rich and complex, especially when you enter into history, they become so complex. But in a nutshell, it seems to me that authority, power has to do in the first place with the practical sphere, and it's an ability to accomplish something, to make a change, sort of the capacity to introduce some sort of a change. And when we think of authority, we tend to just think of power because we think of the guy who's in control. The authority is basically what gives control over a population, is able to impose and in a way enforce a certain order. But in part, we do that because we've lost any distinction between authority and power. So, and we don't understand that power is very different if it's understood as part of authority or if it's understood as a substitute for authority. And what does it mean to say that power is a function of authority? And again, this is a huge theme, but just in kind of a nutshell. Authority has built into it a bearing witness to an order that precedes. So there's essentially, it's not just practical, it's also intellectual. It's a way of understanding and viewing things. But an authority figure um, uh, there cannot be authority without reference to something transcendent. So this is the reason why legitimate authority, and especially authority that's legitimized by just popular consent, has no real authority to it. It becomes pure power because popular consent is a way of avoiding any reference to the transcendent sphere, to God, to metaphysics, to goodness, truth, and beauty, and so forth. But once you lose that reference, you really don't have authority. Authority bears witness to that, and then attempts to make that order that it bears witness to effectively present in at a lower level, the level over which it has oversight, you might say. So there's something essentially transitional about authority.
Hmm.
It's sort of bringing to bear this transcendent order in this particular place. And it's necessary to exercise power to do that, but the exercise of power really is at the service of authority in the first place.
Yeah,
So
you
that's the
quote
beginning of an answer.
you have in this article a quote by Leonard Krieger that says authority was essentially transitional. Its function was to bring principles from a higher realm of being to bear upon the activities of a lower realm of being. And ideas of authority modulated the principles so as to make them relevant without divesting them of their superiority.
Yeah. What that is that that's a money quote.
Yeah, that
As
really is. I
and
looked up
what
who Leonard Krieger is right away.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting. I mean, that I was so happy to find his work because he's not at all coming from any sort of theological context. I mean, he really is just a pure historian of ideas, and but one who studied the ancient Romans and the origins of these. And he says things that make perfect sense in a theological, metaphysical context. So in a way, I found his work to be a great confirmation of this thesis that I was pursuing, more directly in a philosophical way in the light of faith. But he really is a historian, and that I think that captures in a nutshell the heart of the matter.
Yeah. How do I'm maybe going a little bit too far into the
Mhm.
article, but with Plato's Republic, you point out
Yeah,
that it's the best place to find his political philosophy and also his metaphysics.
yeah, yeah,
And you link the two and you say the two coincide.
yeah,
Can you elaborate on that? Because
yeah.
I don't think many people they tend to separate the two,
Oh,
but you
right.
bring the two together, and I think that plays into a little bit of what Leonard Krieger is getting at.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's funny. I separated the two too. The thing that's funny is that for most of my intellectual development, I had a real contempt for political philosophy. I thought politics was all about just making compromise and sorting things out. It was purely pragmatic. And I didn't realize I was operating, I was conceding to the liberal political philosophy, the liberal political order, the meaning of these basic things. So it was in that context that I actually wrote a book on Plato's Republic, which I didn't think of it in terms of authority at all. I was trying to think of it mainly in terms of a metaphysics that was seeking some sort of realization. But now, when I made the turn, I don't know, probably about 10 years ago now, um, it's really striking to me this odd fact about Plato's Republic that I just ignored. Why is it that his most comprehensive metaphysics appears in a book on political philosophy? And I realized I've come to see, it's the inseparability of those is crucial. Now, when we hear that, all philosophy is political, we think that that means you can't do philosophy without taking some sort of political position, and we think of it in terms of social justice. That's not what it means with Plato. It means that basically what philosophy is at its heart is a realization of truth in both the theoretical and the practical order. And metaphysics and politics are the architectonic sciences in that sense, and they fit together. They're ultimately united in this attempt to, in a way, bring to bear through effective witness the ultimate truth of things. And so this is what he means by the philosopher king,
Hmm.
which I never thought about in those. Yeah, the philosopher who sees the forms, this is bearing witness to the highest truth, then goes back down and attempts to make them real as far as prudence enables, through prudence, as far as practical circumstances enable. He tries to translate, to use Krieger's language, these eternal principles into the practical order, and that's what sets the horizon for human existence simply.
Hmm.
And then, which means then if you have no real authority, the whole horizon of human existence is transformed and impoverished, and that's going to affect not just our practical activities, it's going to affect our thinking.
Hmm. Yeah, that's I never linked the two myself. But it's amazing, you talk about you quote Augusto del Noce on the one aspect of authority. I believe you say that's the most forgotten in our age today is linking authority with the primacy of being.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
I mean I've read I think I've read Del Noce article on authority and
yeah,
talking about its reduction to power in terms of kind of what Marx has done to
right.
things. But in addition to Del Noce, you extensively quote, I think someone who's my new favorite thinker. I've been reading as much as
I know who
possible.
you're going to say.
Yeah, Hannah Arendt. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
I
yeah,
I have to say, no wonder Heidegger was quite fascinated
yeah,
by her. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
she's
yeah,
just fascinating. And I actually yesterday I read her article, it's a chapter of a book, What is Authority?
yeah,
And
yeah,
the section that I find most interesting, and I know I'm kind of jumping around here, but
sure.
when you talk about the Christian synthesis, you talk about, okay, it drawing together Jewish strand, the Greek, and then the Roman.
Yeah,
And with the Greek, we kind of mentioned that a little bit with kind of the nature of things, but
yeah,
nature as understood kind of metaphysically,
right.
not just
Yeah,
kind of in terms of physics. But you talk about before getting to maybe into the Jewish strand, the Roman strand, which you mentioned too that Heidegger didn't really like too much. But she talks about the founding aspect and
yeah,
act, which
yeah.
then you talk about her philosophy of human action as I think you call it, or she calls it natality,
Hmm.
but act of bringing something into reality.
Yeah,
Um, and
yeah.
I was thinking too about the John Paul II Institute, marriage and family. Sorry for going off on this
Oh, no.
tangent here, but I've been trying to think about the the meaning of the title of the John Paul II Institute of Marriage and Family ever since going there, and it being all about being like really when you go there you study metaphysics and theology. But I was
Yeah,
thinking, wow,
yeah,
well that is really the source. I mean, there's the human act of
yeah,
like the vow. You found
right.
something. And then there's a physical part of actually the act of bringing into being a child with the
That's right.
family. And
Yeah,
so if we could maybe, I mean, go back to the Rome and
yeah,
the founding of the city of Rome and the
right,
significance of that for the Romans in terms of how they thought about authority and the continuation of that authority. Um,
right. Yeah. Yeah, no, that was a huge eye opener for me. Hannah Arendt is outstanding. She's especially interesting. In fact, I think she's the most interesting thinker I have ever read on the Romans, understanding Roman culture and the meaning of the Romans as the sort of philosophical implication. Because I think that there are very few people that notice it, and I spent most of my life in complete ignorance of all of that, and as I said, a certain distaste for it, in fact. But it's ironic. Heidegger was all about the Greeks, and he, as we know, hated the Jews and he hated the Romans. People don't notice the Roman thing as much, but I mean, he holds the Romans, so the actual Romans, but then Romanticism, the Roman Catholic Church, all these things he sees as of a piece and as a betrayal of philosophy, which is in a way purely Greek and then German for him. I mean, it's interesting that Hannah Arendt is Jewish and then has this deep insight and interest into the Romans. So uh, now I think that she actually makes the claim that the Greeks had no sense of authority, and she completely ignores the Jewish contribution, which I find really fascinating. She says this is an essentially Roman phenomenon,
hmm.
and I think it's a Christian phenomenon that integrates these three dimensions. Um,
Do you
but
think
yeah, go
he
ahead.
partially, though, do you think he partially didn't like the Roman? And I know this is not exclusively the reason, but in the founding of Rome, I know that they set up on Capitoline Hill
Hmm.
an asylum because we'll
Hmm.
take anybody, all
Yeah,
the any, and so it's not an ethnic thing,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
so
That's interesting.
a universal dimension. And I don't know, I mean, I haven't read enough Heidegger to look into how much does like obviously he was anti-Semitic, but how much does the ethnic kind of the destiny of the
Yeah,
Germanic people and then
sure.
going back thinking that they're like, descendants of the Dorians or down
Hmm.
in Greece. I mean, there's kind of a little bit of an arrogance there. Um,
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. I think there's also a sense of the kind of pragmatic dimension. I mean, he sees, and it is interesting if you were to kind of isolate certain Roman values that seems to be very modern. Um, and there was a kind of radical anti-modernity, and I think Heidegger associated the origins of modernity with the Greeks and the Jews and the Romans. I actually think that the essence of modernity is the rejection of the Christian synthesis of the three, but that's a whole other story. But let's just get back to this about the founding of the city. Arendt has such insight into that, how definitive this was, that the founding of the city was really was in a way the absolute to which everything else is relative. I think to understand this properly, I don't think I mentioned this in the essay, but I don't know if you're familiar with Eliade, Mircea Eliade
yeah,
has this
yeah.
book, Sacred
University
and
of Chicago,
there you go.
Romanian.
Yep,
Yeah.
fascinating,
He
fascinating
is.
work.
I was always
Um,
kind of warned about him, but
yeah,
then I started reading him and I'm like, what are you talking about? This
yeah.
guy's absolutely like, yeah,
Oh,
fascinating.
there's so much insight. I mean, what becomes of it, where it all goes is another question. But there's so much insight there. But I mean, his interpretation of the founding of you put a totem pole in the earth, that becomes then the center of the cosmos,
Hmm.
and in that founding act in a way now gives rise to a world. So before that, you don't have a world. Now you have a world. Why? Because you have a reference point that allows you to give structure to everything else. It sort of, concentric circles radiates outwards, a kind of things have their place, they have their order, they have their direction, they make sense in relation to each other. So much so that if you were to lose this, then you're plunged into chaos. Well, that insight, I think, is the Romans achieved in a kind of world historical way. So not just for a tribe, but the founding of the city of Rome was very much for them the establishment of the cosmos, and that center in relation to which everything else makes a certain sense. And that founding act, which had a theological dimension that people tend to overlook, even though it was very much also a human act, that for the Romans, in a way, because it's the absolute to which everything else is relative. This is the answer that you asked your students. Where does legitimacy come from? This is how the Romans would answer it. The senators are such precisely because they belong to the original founding families. So they represent something of an actual lifeline that connects the present to the past. And when they wouldn't create laws would be presented to them and they would acknowledge them.
Mhm.
And they're acknowledging, that's what the authority does. It doesn't make something, it gives something an official stamp. And what they're doing is, in a way, drawing on the absoluteness and the authority then of the original founding. They're extending it now also to this law. So now this law has a kind of validity because of its relationship to the authority. So it's authentic, we might say. It's actually it's connected to the first principle, and that gives it a kind of authority. Now, there's something you can see just absolutely wonderful about this, but I think you can also see what would happen if you don't have a metaphysical dimension or a theological dimension. This is why I think the Roman contribution really needs to be integrated with the Greeks and the Jews.
Yeah. Is this why, I mean, Caesar Augustus, does the name Augustus have anything to do with kind of the augmentation that you say is
Yeah.
related to the word authority?
Hmm.
Because I
And
mean,
that,
it's after the Civil
yep.
Wars, and he, in some ways, I mean, it's when Rome, the city reaches. I mean, not to that point, but they saw the whole empire as the
Yeah.
extension of the eternal city.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if the Caesars, who are, are in succession of him, are part of that kind of have served
Yeah.
that augmenting
That
role.
that's really excellent. That's fascinating. It's a little more complex, the etymology there, or the
Okay.
connection there. But you're onto something that I think people miss. Part of the name just means sort of the
Yeah.
the august,
Yes.
the
Yeah.
dignified one. But there's a connection between that and authority that we don't normally see. So he said, I don't have any special position. I'm one of the senators, but I'm distinct only in authority, only in dignity.
Hmm.
I have my dignity transcends the others, but not my power. Actually, he says I have more authority, but the same power, and it's really interesting. Now, there's a connection between authority and dignity. Now, what does dignity mean? This is another thing we tend to miss. It's actually fundamentally an aesthetic category. To have dignity is to have a
Hmm.
presence that radiates forth and has a kind of inherent nobility and excellence and radiance, light. And this is essential to the very meaning of authority. It seems to me. And there, that's what Augustus was claiming for himself. Now that to be bright is to illuminate. So there's a sense in which the very brightness of the authority has a kind of augmenting quality that brings order increasingly to the darkness, and that's how the Romans understood themselves. We tend to think of them as violent people, power hungry, and all of that is true also. But fundamentally, they saw themselves as a gift to the whole world, bringing order and civilization. And if you set aside the very real abuses of power and violence and so forth, the history of the Roman Empire was a history of people wanting to be conquered by the Romans because they received the word civilization.
Yeah.
We tend to think of it as a generic term, but it really means the extension of the Roman Empire, and it's sort of an extension of the light of this authority that actually gives order to a society and allows you to live in a kind of a dignified way, to live in a way that has a kind of public order and there's a yeah, dignity is just the best word for it.
Yeah, right now in Krakow, there's a lot of people who say that when the Poles, who were, if you want to say, civilized by the Bohemians, I mean, in terms of being baptized, who then were baptized
Yeah.
by, you can go all the way back, but they wanted to be more Roman than anybody else because they were
Mhm.
perhaps one of the last, and they had to
Is that
prove.
right?
Yeah, so they say that the culture of Poland really, really, even though you have this kind of Sarmatism thing going on, like, but they really tried to take in the Roman identity as much as possible, and so that's why you see, I mean, not just in terms of the architecture, but how they thought of themselves, even when you think about the references to like kind of the res publica. You have the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the res publica going. It's Rome that they're
Yeah.
really
Wow.
thinking about. And but I was and speaking of dignity and nobility and beauty on this
Mhm.
theme, I mean, just walking around the city here is kind of an education and in beauty. But I was glad to see, and when you're talking about this stuff, you have these great quotes by Schiller, the German,
Oh,
I don't
yeah.
even know how to classify him, poet, playwright,
Poet.
uh,
Yeah. Right. He's everything.
everything.
Doctor,
Yeah,
even. Yeah. Historian. Yeah.
I know. And he has, I mean, I've been reading his, The Aesthetic Education of Man. And when you
Yeah.
talk about that kind of dignity, I'm also wondering maybe you could think of it as kind of the nobility. And you say that it's good you have in um, one of your footnotes here, you say we should maybe replace the phrase, noble soul with authority. And he has this great stuff about how it's a nature may be called noble, okay, or maybe authoritative, which possesses the gift of transforming by its method of handling it, even the most limited matter and pettiest object into an infinite one. And then you go down a little bit later here and you say it must set free everything around it, even what is lifeless. But beauty is the only possible expression of freedom in phenomena. In addition to Schiller, I've been listening to actually Christopher Alexander's
Oh my
Timeless
goodness.
Way of
You're
Building a
you're
little bit
connecting with
here.
all the right people. This is
Okay, well,
fantastic.
I'm on
Yeah.
a little bit of a Christopher Alexander kick.
Yeah.
Anyways, and when he talks about bringing things to life, like sometimes he's a
Yeah.
little bit like vague, but I think
Yeah.
I know what he's getting at. Like
Hmm.
you see a building and then you know if it's alive,
Yeah.
and you see a piece of art and you know
Yeah.
whether or not it's alive.
Yeah.
And the way he describes it is something like there's almost like a nobility to it.
Right.
Okay, but there's also a dignified nobility. And there's something free about it, and
Yeah.
it's full of
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
but it's like the beautiful. So I'm wondering. I was thinking about this the other day because walking through the Krakus Rinnik, there's just these certain pieces of architecture, and it all together goes together as a whole. But there's certain things that just almost in a way authoritatively stand there. It's
Hmm.
almost like they shine forth
Yeah.
more than than something else and even though you don't know who the author of or the architect of that
Right.
building is, it
Yeah.
just is there's something glowing about it. And
Yeah.
it's almost like you hear like the Roman architecture. It's not built for the sake of utility, But even the
Right.
Colosseum is there to stay. And I remember
Yeah.
Hamby talking about like it's like the architecture is there's a permanence to it.
Yeah. Right.
So I mean, do you
Yeah.
think
I mean,
about with
there's,
art and beauty and authority?
I mean, so these are right. That's exactly. I mean, we just tend not to see that at all. I mean, as having any connection. So, we tend to think of authority mostly in practical terms. Authority is the guy who kind of puts order in things and control. Sometimes, by extension, you can think of it in the theoretical order if you think about what warrants assent in a proposition or something. There's this question, or that's a kind of argument is an argument from authority. So what role does that play? But it's minor. We mostly think of it as practical. Um, at one point, I started thinking, well, we need to recover the intellectual significance of authority to see that authority has as much to do with truth as it does with goodness. And then finally, it occurred to me, well, of course, the reason it's both is because it's ultimately beauty
Hmm.
that is at the heart of what authority is. And when the moment I saw that, this is one of these sort of paradigm shifting moments for me. You realize this, the way that a building, a proper building, so one that really, as you say, radiates, it glows. There's a sense in which it's got a dignity that just shines through. That dignifies everything around it, right? So
Yeah.
so you see that there's a sense that even the pigeons that are flying around it receive a certain kind of dignity from this building. Um, what's going on there? It's augmenting, the life around it, and communicating dignity to these things. Well, augment, augere auctoritas. This is the origin of it's etymologically is what authority is all about. And if you think now what's going on with this building and this work of art, that's what a ruler is meant to be, like an authority figure. There's always, even in a purely democratic society, there's always going to be some ruler, some ultimate authority figure,
Yeah.
symbolic speaking. And it seems to me that that's going to be the determining horizon in any given sort of political community. And it's very different if you think of that of the person who's in this position of authority or who has power. If you think of him as just like a guy like all the rest of us, and he just happens to be here, and we vote him in. So we try to reduce authority to the most minimal exercise of power possible and put in all sorts of constraints. What we're actually doing is impoverishing the whole horizon of human existence. So it's going to affect our art. It's going to affect our thinking. It's going to affect our philosophizing. It's going to affect our poetry, our families, the way we think of our families. If by contrast, the person who is the authority figure recognizes this, I call it martyrological, this responsibility to bear witness to truth, beauty, and goodness, in the before the face of God.
Hmm.
That person will glow and radiate like this properly built building, and symbolically will help generate an order in which everything else, now this is subsidiarity too, will have the order that's proper to it, so that it's, you can think better. I mean, this is the thing, you can think better inside a beautiful building,
Yeah.
or in a culture that actually has dignity. There's a way in which your mind naturally sees things as having an infinite, like Schiller says, a kind of an infinite substance, as opposed to just being instruments of use. And then if it's all instruments of use, there's no reference point for your thinking at all, and everything becomes manipulation and you know um, pragmatism essentially.
Well, think
So
about
it
like
affects everything. Yeah,
walking around. Like, I mean, a lot of these towns that are ordered in such a way, they're university towns too, but like it's almost like the setting, the design is conducive, like you said. It's like jigged to use like a Matthew Crawford term, it's like a jigged in a certain way, so it actually it can easily be like it can easily ferment there.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
like I was on my way to work today, and I my bus goes along the Vistula, and
Mhm.
I that's the river. I just noticed that because most of the churches are facing like ad Orientem. Okay, so they're facing the east,
Mhm.
right? And but I noticed that the Scout Church, which is like dedicated, it's a very important church. It's right there on the Vistula.
Mhm.
And it used to be on its own little island, and it's like on the rock. That's what it's called, on the rock. And it's where Saint Stanislaw, who is the patron of Poland, um,
Okay.
and it's where he was like in the location around where he was martyred,
Okay.
and by the king. And he kind of plays almost this kind of like, the prophet anointing the king kind of role. But
Mhm.
the church, it's the only church that is facing northwest. And so
Okay.
I like did a little like, little research to say,
Yeah.
why is that intentional? Like it has to be intentional. I mean, there are some churches that are not uh,
Yeah.
little kind of newer churches that are not facing the east.
And
But
that's
it
simply
says
because
that one
people have
is
lost any sense of place
yeah,
for the
but that
newer
one's
one. Yeah.
intentional because they
Right.
say it's pointing to the place of his martyrdom, which then gave witness, you know. So I was thinking like, okay, so all the churches are in a way and are bearing witness to
Yeah.
the right the one, if you want to say, the risen one in the direction of the rising sun, and it gives order to then the city.
Yeah.
Um,
No, that's absolutely true. And this is the right and very concrete way to think about, church state relations, which are obviously, really crucial ones today. And that question is
yeah.
becoming live today in a whole new way. But there's, there's some really worrisome interpretations in both directions, that a kind of crass Christian nationalism is growing and a kind of theocratic sense on the one hand, and then, a radical sort of progressive sort of democratism, which I think is uh, it, I mean, they need each other, these two forms in the end.
Yeah.
I mean, but what you need is a sense of the church as being the principal authority in the sense of being the principal witness to um, uh, to God and the ultimate truth of things. And as bearing witness to that, in a way, it frees the political order to be authoritative in its proper sense. And so there is a hierarchy here, and the church has a kind of authority that very properly and truly bears on the political order, but it's not a theocracy. It's
Hmm.
not a it sort of liberates the proper authority and gives properly theological grounding to the political authority in itself, the integrity of that. And then if it's understood as, so if the state's authority arises as, you might say, a gift as a gift, authority has built into it this generosity. And so, the authority of the state is precisely then what liberates families to be integral wholes in themselves, and so on and so forth. It communicates this generous proliferation of centers of authority, as opposed to, when you think of power, you've got a control center, and then you've got equally, democratic sort of leveled extensions of absolute centralized power. That's a totally different thing. And it's wrongheaded to try to take that and baptize it or something. I
Yeah.
think that's one of the dangers, I think, that certain kinds of integralism will get themselves into.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a couple maybe comments on that. You mentioned that in Plato, in the descent to the cave, it's not only kind of bearing witness to the truth, but it has to be freely accepted.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you think too, I mean, I read that John Paul II was thinking about taking the name Pope Stanislav because he wanted to
Wow.
really, and somebody said no, you can't, you shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
he wanted to, bring he wanted to put himself in line with that saint of
Yeah.
Poland, who was the martyr. But
That's beautiful.
John Paul II's favorite, I remember hearing at the John Paul II Institute that from another Stanislav Griegel,
Uh-huh.
that John Paul II's like favorite passage in the whole scripture is the truth shall set you free.
Yeah.
That you just don't feel like that maybe is being appreciative enough in these discussions about dignitatis humanum and some other discussions in the church today.
Yeah, no, and that's something I'm really grateful, one among many things, grateful to my father for. That was really a big, he always insisted that there is a real development in dignitas humani, but it's not because the church has now reconciled herself to modern liberalism, which is how so many people have interpreted it, and then you get the reactionaries that want to eliminate any development at all and make it just a purely pragmatic thing. I mean, I think my father, his point was really true that um, there was a development in the understanding of how deeply uh, freedom requires truth and truth requires freedom. That freedom is part of the very meaning of truth. I mean, because the truth is ultimately love, and you don't learn to love coercively, which doesn't mean that there aren't legitimate uses of coercive power all over the place, sure, but at the heart of it, there's a free assent and a free, you appropriate it for yourself, and that's the only way really to understand truth too,
Hmm.
um, not just love.
Can you maybe elaborate on that with love being at the core with this kind of the founding act? Because you mentioned that Hannah Arendt is maybe looking at it as okay, you've got the the eternal Rome, the founding of eternal Rome, and the fullness is in the past.
Yeah.
But the way, and the way I've been kind of taught to think about it is that, and maybe Augustine, I haven't fully read the City of God, but maybe there's something with the act of Christ that
Yeah.
in some ways founding this if you want to
Yeah.
say the
Yeah.
kingdom is there's a fullness in that act, but since there's such a connection to the transcendent and it's God and mediated I mean it's got the God man who does this.
Yeah.
There's also the you think about the fullness in the future, and
Yeah.
so the present is connected to the fullness of this act in the past always
Yeah.
and that fullness comes into it's refounded in the moment of the present right now, but yet it also has its fullness in the future. So you have that already, but not yet, and so you have that dimension of hope there
Yeah.
as well. So like this you hear about the faith is the substance of things hoped for.
Mhm.
So it's like, but in this, and Pope Benedict in Spe Salvi makes a lot of this is like the substance, the eternal life, if we can, is already here.
Give it. Yeah. Yeah.
It's not something that it's not like, okay,
Chase after.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So is there any like way of like with this Christian
Yeah.
synthesis that
Yeah.
you're doing is like Jesus brings together all of that?
I mean, that's you. You've got a lot of insights there. That's really remarkable. I would affirm, yeah. The way I think about it, I mean, it's basically that you Christianity is a synthesis of the Greeks, Romans, and Jews. So that's my tagline. And the Germans as Germanic tribes, the
I
barbarians.
heard Andrew Willard Jones
Yeah.
stress that.
Yeah. Yeah, I had used that in a talk before. I don't think I mentioned it so much in this article, and he wanted to bring it. He infers some things that are a little bit different from what I infer, but his insights are excellent on that. But just in terms of this particular question, it seems to me that um, the Romans do turn us to the past. I mean, this is Hannah Arendt. I mean, she kind of forces the issue. This is, I think, what happens when you absolutize the Romans over against the others. You know, she said that the growth augmentation of authority is actually it's a growth towards the past, and that I don't think that's quite right. There's some insight there, but and then you get as a reaction to that. He's not talking specifically about Hannah Arendt, but I don't know if you've read David Bentley Hart on this question of tradition and so forth. And
Yeah, well, it started because his critique of Newman.
yeah,
Um,
right, yeah,
anyways, yeah, go
it's
on that
brutal.
because I've actually I read that little. It's like a little book
Yeah, yeah.
on tradition and what is it called?
I don't even remember, but I have to say that's it's brutal. It's not Hart at his best. It's I think it's so deeply problematic. It's almost horrifying. I'd love to talk to him about it at some point, but
Yeah.
you know, he takes this line of Christianity as like totally revolutionizing paganism, whereas
Hmm.
I like to think of Christianity as integrating and transforming from within. So for him, the paganism, you know, represented by the Romans is pure backward turning. They're necrophiliacs, you know, obsessed with the dead and what came before. And
Yeah.
Christianity
Yeah.
breaks us free from that, and it's pure future. It's for him, it's pure future, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
But I think that's precisely what happens when you don't have the Catholic synthesis, if I might say. So I think of the Jews as representing the future. You know, it's so interesting. So much. It's not the there is a remembering, but it's interesting. The remembering is what do we remember? We remember the promise.
Hmm.
And the promise is, you know, the fullness is going to come at the end.
Yeah.
Um, and then the Greeks are timeless. You know, it's the transcendent. They have eternity in a way. So they go up, and you have this beautiful image of the past and the future, and then the eternity, and then what Christianity is precisely then the integration of the eternal, the past, and the future precisely in the present.
Is that
And
Balthazar?
that
Balthazar, does he have that image? Like
he
even
might
the
somewhere.
cross?
And yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. I wasn't thinking about that, you know, but I
Yeah.
mean, I think various people have various forms of this. But it seems to me that it's really interesting to think of Christianity as so it's not turning away from the past or freedom from the past. There is a freedom from the past, but which is also a freedom for the past. And it's a genuine hope for the future, which isn't like a mad chasing after something that's always, you know, deferring it, being deferred further into the future, but it's you already participated in it, and it's yet to come. But this is also because of a timeless perspective that Greek metaphysics sort of brings. So you have time and eternity in its complete fullness in Christianity, which I think is just, I mean, you know, how can one not be Christian when you start looking into these things? And so many of these fundamental human realities you see get suddenly um, recapitulated in the perfect way in the kind of Christian synthesis. You just throw up your hands and you say, you know, God is great.
Yeah, there's something so fitting about how it all comes together. And it just there's, you have a lot of people today writing on order and the need for that.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
you've had popular people like Jordan Peterson trying to talk about it in some like archetypal way, but it's like once you see what the Christian synthesis has done, it's like you kind of feel like Chesterton where it's like
yeah,
you're discovering something that's already there, and you think you kind of invented it. But
yeah,
it's to me, I mean, going back to this thing too of there being a fullness. I mean, with hope. I mean, is that why David Bentley Hart, when he talks about hope, he doesn't like hope? And I think
isn't
I
like
saw an
hope.
exchange between the two of you at Notre Dame once, where he really did not like. He doesn't. I don't know if he consider hope to even be a theological virtue. Um, I know it's in
I
relation to
don't.
the Balthazar stuff
Yeah,
during Pope, but he wants that almost certainty
right.
that
Yeah, I mean, for him, the slightest sense of I don't know is nihilism, you know?
yeah.
And it just seems to me, I mean, obviously, there's so much involved in this. And matter of fact, I'm working on a book now, finally, the third volume of the freedom thing. I finally broke ground on that. I'm very excited about that. And I have in mind to do a kind of a deep engagement with this question about universal salvation at the end of it, and I will no doubt engage with Hart there. It seems to me, you know, the resolution of all of it has to be the eternal temporal event of the crucifixion and descent into hell and resurrection. That's all. Um, and there we see that it is hope because it opens up the possibility of hell in a whole new way, but also has the perfect escape from it, and both are there. And it's in the perfect sacrifice of Christ. But that doesn't, you know, it's not like working out of a syllogism where in the end, if things don't cash out to absolute universal salvation, then nothing makes any sense along the way. I mean, the problem is nothing makes any sense if it also cashes out, because then the question of that position is always, how can action and decision and choice, how can any of these things really mean anything if the outcome is finally determined somehow? And I know that Hart has an answer to those things, but it seems to me those are really compelling questions that need to be addressed. Yeah, I mean, in the end, it's faith, hope, and love.
Yeah.
Um, and I like to think of love as associated with beauty, um, faith with receiving from the past, and hope as movement towards the future. So you've got the synthesis of all three.
That's funny. Well, maybe, I know we're coming, to being almost an hour now. But, just, I wonder if you have a few thoughts. You mentioned, the death of Christ on the cross and the descent into hell and, the resurrection and ascension and all of that, when understood in terms of authority and this founding act, is but to think about you think all about a lot of these establishments of cities, even in Rome, I think there's a not only just drawing kind of the lines of the
Yeah,
city, but there's a sacrifice that's
yeah,
part of it, and then that
yeah,
continues.
yeah,
But you think too about every sacrament, um, and you think too about the establishments of these new kingdoms, like establishment of the kingdom of Poland is the baptism of Mieszko. Um, and you're partaking in that reality, which
yeah,
is in a way a sacrificial an eternal sacrifice, right? So
yeah.
like what does sacrifice have to do? What's that connection with authority?
That what a profound and interesting question, and I don't know that I have a very good answer for you. I'd like to think about that. Um, Let me just first draw attention to. I mean, this is the beauty of what you see in Arendt, or at least what she opens up. Something like a martyr's act becomes a kind of abiding reality that we all draw energy from, in a way, in our own activity. I mean, there's something really beautiful about that we all experience in prayer in some sense, but a lot of people want to make that just kind of psychological. You're kind of inspired by this model or something, but I think there's much more to it, and it's more ontological, and the mystery is quite real. Um, but in terms of sacrifice at the founding of cities, it's funny. People, I get random emails from people every few weeks telling me that I need to read Rene Girard, and this is a major theme for him. Um, and I've tried to read some things, and he just doesn't speak to me. And I recognize that that's a failure in myself, and I need to find my way in. Um, and maybe I'd be able to give a better answer to your question. But but it seems to me, if you think just on the face of it, there's something about this sacrifice. It's essentially martyrological. There's a letting go. Here's something really interesting. The heart of both sacrifice and authority is traditio, a
Hmm.
handing over. Christ handed himself over to death, but this is precisely in the handing over of the authority of the Father to
Well,
the,
because you have that since the Eucharist isn't the Gospel of John just talk.
yeah,
He's handed over to him. It's
yeah,
almost like they're playing
yeah,
volley with him.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it.
It's beautiful. Yeah, so there is a kind of a handing over that is at the essence of what a sacrifice is. And it seems to me that that's a kind of a participation in this receiving and passing on that is at the heart of what authority is all about. So it would make sense to connect that with the founding of a city. I would need to think through details
Hmm. Well,
more, but that's really suggestive and very interesting.
well, maybe we can
Do
bring
you
this
have
to a close.
thoughts?
Pardon me?
Do you have thoughts on it? I guess you
Well,
expressed them already, but yeah,
no, I mean, well, with I don't know. I don't really have like developed too much. I mean, to me, sacrifice is just something that it's just fascinating that this is such a, universal phenomenon. And then also, like you think about kings, you talk about the aura of
yeah,
kings,
yeah,
and then the role of the king in also being priest prophet. You sometimes you have the king as also something like a priest in
yeah,
some
right,
sense.
yeah,
But this offering, I'm just fascinated too. Like a while ago, I got into
yeah,
like some like phenomenology of the gift stuff and like looking at some, and if you want to say like so, I don't know if you call them like social anthropology works, like the famous one is like the gift, and
right,
there having to be like this gift exchange at the heart of all
yeah, yeah,
society, but ultimately a gift exchange that has a transcendent dimension to it, and there's a almost a proper grammar to the gift. It has to it has to be like the best. It can't be,
mhm, yeah,
something that you are, anyways, but it's just fascinating to me that that is at the heart and of things. And I'm always trying to kind of think, well, if that's kind of like fundamental to who we are as human beings, I'm eager to read what you will claim the counterfeits are today, because like what are those? But somebody, maybe we could bring this to a close with somebody who described one of my friends from St. Louis University described Rene Girard as the last Nietzschean.
mm,
And I always was like, what do you mean by that? And I'm still kind of trying to unpack that, what that
yeah,
means. But you mentioned, because in the beginning of your article, okay, do you mention this here? Well, anyways, you mentioned, at least in the talk with Andrew Willard Jones, you talk about Nietzsche, and this is my one of my favorite passages from Nietzsche's Nietzsche in the Gay Science, and I think also he has it in maybe Thus Spake Zarathustra, where the madman comes down and we've killed God, and we've
yeah,
the part that I like the most though is that we've wiped clean like the horizon, and
yeah,
the all the coordinates are off, and we're
yeah,
just in some ways like lost. And you mentioned with Andrew Willard Jones how for Nietzsche that, and your dad really brought this out too for me,
yeah.
was that was not something like, yay, liberation. It's
Right,
it's
right.
it's like there's a tinge of sadness there.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and a sense of responsibility and an infinite task. I mean, he despaired of the idea that that God comes back to life.
Hmm.
Um, uh, so he's just sort of takes for granted the absence. The word I heard at this conference I was at this past weekend from Cyril O'Regan. He spoke of the disaster of modernity, and he used Nietzsche to interpret what disaster means. It means the removal of the star, which is the lodestar, in relation to which everything makes sense. And when that is eclipsed, it's like, the tribes in Eliada, or, the center no longer holds, and there's no sense to anything. That was a profound suffering for Nietzsche. But it's so odd to think that what Nietzsche really desired above all was authority. But I've come to think that, and when you think in those terms, you read him in a very different way. He thinks that this loss of authority is tragic, and he's trying to find a compensation, but doesn't consider the possibility of the church.
Hmm. Yeah, it's people who also were maybe very much influenced by him or what he saw, like in you mentioned, or I think Pope Benedict in Space Salvi mentions Horkheimer and Adorno
Mhm.
as they're having to be to make sense of all any of this. Even what he says to make up for the injustices of history, there
Yeah,
has to be resurrection, but the resurrection of the flesh.
yeah,
There was this despair that if that's even
yeah,
possible.
yeah, yeah,
So, yes. Well, Dr. Schindler, I want to thank you for coming on. Always pleasure and delight to talk to you.
yeah,
So I've always, whenever I encourage everybody to go out and buy all of Dr. Schindler's books and read all of his articles in Communio. Most of them, I think you got a new one out on education, and
yeah.
that's I think you could download the PDF too on Communio's website. And so that's the thing I'm going to be reading next. Um,
I'm just finishing one today on confirmation that has been a lot more fun than I thought it would be. But you should encourage people to come to the John Paul II Institute to study. We would like,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Well, I'll
throw in a
tell
little
you,
plug
I
for the
met my
institute.
lovely wife at the John Paul
Yeah,
II
yep,
Institute,
yep,
not only for that, but
yeah,
also I think I always tell people if you hear wait till your mind kind of is just opened and you think of these mundane realities as symbols and connecting it to this transcendent realm. And the approach is, I think, the most novel and compelling and beautiful thing in the Catholic world. So I told everybody when I was at Word on Fire about the John Paul II, and I think I convinced all these people who didn't really know about the Institute, even a lot of CUA PhD grads
yeah, yeah,
who knew about the Institute, but I'm like, but let me tell you
yeah,
how it happened. So I'll tell you, I tell everybody, but I encourage everybody to
yeah,
take a look. You have a new program, right?
yeah. On
In
education, yeah,
education. Okay.
yeah.
So we need a lot of people, good people who are well formed in this
Mhm.
type of thinking in the educational world. So Dr. Schindler, thank you so
Yeah.
much. And
Thank you, Bobby. It's always really a great pleasure. We need to see each other. We might see each other this summer,
oh
right?
yes, yeah,
We need
indeed.
to hang out more often. But thank you for the
Yeah.
invitation.
Well, thank you for coming on. And
Yeah,
everybody, check out our other episodes with Dr. Schindler and encourage you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And we're going to have a new episode coming out with Richard Decloux soon again. So stay tuned for that.